So we are looking at week 13, day 2. We just got done talking about the 20th century and the different trends, the very many trends that we're going to see in the 20th century. And now we're going to take a little bit closer look at each of them and a key composer. So we're going to start with that Impressionism. So we said that Impressionism was growing out of France, and the composer that we're going to look at today is Debussy. So Debussy spans between the 19th century and the 20th century. He bridges it similar to what we found with Beethoven. He was a student at the Paris Conservatory. He's very famous for his orchestrations of pieces and the colors that he uses, and for his piano pieces. He's got a lot of wonderful miniature piano pieces, so that's hearkening back to what we saw in that Romantic era, preludes and etudes. He wrote quite a few ballets. And he was very anti-German. He was in Paris for most of his life. He was there when Paris bombed. He was bombed. He died during World War I. He investigates new tone colors for the orchestra and for the piano. His melodies are a little bit more fragmented. And by investigating new colors and layering his chords together, his tonality becomes clouded. He still is a tonal composer, though. You still can easily hear a home pitch. His harmonies may sound vague. He avoids heavy sonorities. I think his music sounds light, or will sound light to you. They're very subtle. He likes very subtle changes, very mysterious shades. He does come up with some new harmonies, but they're gentle. They're not what I would call dissonant on the ear. So the piece that you've got in your book for Debussy is on page 315. They give you a nice description of the type of harmonic vocabulary that he would use on 313. They describe the piece a little bit. They talk about how his harmonies tend to move in parallel motion. And there's a good view of that on 314. Again, you can see the parallel movement even if you can't read the actual notes there that are on the music. But this piece is called Clouds. It's from his 3 nocturnes. So they're symphonic poems. They're 3 separate symphonic poems that he grouped together, are called 3 nocturnes. So a symphonic poem, we know, means it's a 1-movement orchestral piece. We know that it has a program to it. Debussy did his program, or made his pieces program, by giving them descriptive titles. He did not necessarily give you a whole story to go with it, or movement by movement break it down, for instance, like what we saw with Berlioz. So he's calling this one that we're taking a look at, the Debussy Clouds, is what he's given the name of this nocturne. Nocturne was the name of a miniature piano piece in the Romantic era. Nocturne meant nighttime scene, if you recall. So that's a harken back to Chopin. I think he studied his works a lot. We hear a lot of the same techniques in his piano works. So Debussy is referencing a painting here by James McNeill Whistler. And the Clouds is a nature picture, so programmatic in that work. And I think that he's trying to make you see, with his thick, light texture, cumulus clouds. So thick clouds moving maybe across the sky. The theme that you hear doesn't function conventionally in the fact that it doesn't just come right out and make a declaration of it, or it doesn't seem to lead anywhere. There are a couple of different motives that we hear pass between the clarinet and then the bassoon, and then the English horn comes in. Vague rhythm, it's based on an octatonic scale. So that's one of those new different scales that those 20th century composers are liking to experiment with. Octatonic means that it's using alternating half and whole steps up through that octave. So that's obscuring tonality there a little bit. The cloud music also has parallel motion. All the pitches are either moving up or moving down. Parallel motion is a big trend among impressionistic composers. This has a loose ABA form, so again, it's not as strict as what we would expect with a sonata allegro structure, and that's what most of our symphonic poems in that 19th century were. It's avant-garde in the way that the music is fluid, in the way that the structure is a little bit looser with that ABA form. There's not sharp divisions between the introductions of one theme to the next. The parallel chords I think that he's definitely trying to paint a picture here of the clouds with both the texture and the colors that he's using. I also think that there's some drum rolls in here as you'll listen that maybe act as thunder. So on 315, you can follow along. It'll give you a nice map here as you walk through the different themes. So you'll notice with these chords moving, you've got some parallel motion. The voice is all moving the same direction up or down. You have a little bit of contrary motion going on, but very much soft. Even when the layers are coming together with more instruments, it still is a lighter sound, a fluffier sound. So Debussy music is beautiful. I think you'll really enjoy it. Impressionistic music tends to be very calming. I think the pictures it paints are beautiful. I encourage you, after you've listened to the piece, to Google impressionistic paintings, or in particular look up some paintings of Monet. And take a look and see if you can find the parallels between the colors, between the lack of sharp lines, of the form being a little bit more watery or nebulous. The next example that your text takes you through is the complete opposite. And it is a piece by Igor Stravinsky. And you've got a long explanation of it here on 317 and then going into the listening guide on 319. But Stravinsky was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. His father worked for the Imperial Opera. He's considered one of a handful of the most influential composers of the 20th century. He starts out writing in a neoclassical style. So that's what we saw Brahms doing, hearkening back, and Mahler, hearkening back to the forms, maybe pushing the element a little bit in harmony and structure, but hearkening back to those structured forms. He also is one of the first composers to start incorporating jazz into his music. He attended law school, and then he studied with Rimsky-Korsakov, who's one of the Russian Five. So you can expect then that you're going to hear nationalistic elements into his music as well. Because of the Russian Revolution, he spent the first part of his career in France, and then later he immigrated to the United States. The Ballet Russe was probably the most important ballet company in the Western European world at the time. They moved to Paris because of all the political turmoil in Russia. And so Stravinsky was in Paris as well, and they commissioned him to write 3 ballets. And through these 3 ballets, they're Firebird, Petrushka, and Rite of Spring, you can see his style change as he starts to embrace the next trend that we'll talk about, which is primitivism. So his first early works really follow the form of nationalism, especially what he learned from his teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov, or from that Russian Five. His works are considered avant-garde because they are experimental, they're radical, they're a little bit unorthodox, they're pushing the boundaries of normal, a little bit more abstract, but very much still using romantic forms and using nationalistic identities. By the time that he's writing Firebird, his orchestra is getting much more colorful, just similar to Debussy. He's using more instruments, he's using more rhythm. The Firebird is Adventures of Ivan is what the story is, if you're familiar with that Russian fairy tale, who encounters a benevolent fairy who's endowed with these magical powers, and then an evil magician and a magical Firebird. It's a wonderful story. Then he moved into Petrushka, which is, again, another Russian folktale. So we're still seeing this nationalistic features. And so there's a puppet that, from a carnival, a hapless puppet who comes to life and mingles with people at the fair. We start to see his harmonies become harsher. We start to see multiple tonalities building on top of each other. So we start to see what's called polytonality or polytonal. If a piece is polytonal, it means that you have two tonic centers or two home pitches going on at the same time. It'd be as if I was playing a piece and I was playing in the key of C in my right hand and the key of F sharp in my left hand. It's going to create a lot of dissonance. Very short motives, but still those folk tunes. By the time we get to Rite of Spring, his third opera in 1913, this is really his first major masterpiece. And it galvanized a lot of public opinion, pro and con. Audiences found the plot very scandalous. The plot is about the pagan ritual of sacrificing virgin dancers to the gods. And it has unrelenting rhythm. It's got a lot of violent offbeats. It has a lot of ostinato to it. Huge orchestra to it. Very much rejecting tonality and the fact that you have polytonality. You have atonality, which means you can't hear a home pitch at all. Primitivism, if you're calling a piece primitivism, you're saying that it's deliberately evoking primitive power through insistent rhythms and percussive sounds. Did not have a lasting effect on 20th century music. It's pretty harsh to listen to. There aren't a lot of composers that run with this style and take off of it after, admiring it. It still has a nationalistic tendency. There are still Russian folk songs in it. They're very crude, short little fragments. It's hard for the audience even to appreciate the folk songs in it because they are disguised and they're broken apart. Again, as I talked about a few minutes ago with 20th century music, it almost becomes more interesting to look at on paper than it is to listen to it. So with Rite of Spring, this first performance really caused a public riot. The audiences were shocked and infuriated by the violent sounds in the percussion section, the violent sounds from the string section, and very provocative choreography. With this being a ballet, there were dancers. The ballet really has no real story to it. It's very abstract. As I said, it's these virgin dancers being sacrificed to the gods. It's written in 4 sections. And it's an interesting piece from a historical standpoint. I encourage you to read through 317 and 318. When you get to 319, it takes you through the 4 sections, which is what you have on your canvas to listen to. This is an orchestral version of it, and that's how it's done most times now. I have seen it done as an orchestra version several times. I have not seen it as a ballet other than on YouTube or on a video, not performed as a ballet quite as much anymore. But it works through these 4 sections, and I want you to listen for these primitivism elements. So with the introduction, you're going to notice that it has a very halting, jagged theme. It's in the bassoon, and it's the very highest register of the bassoon. Expressionism and primitivism growing out of it tend to really exploit the very high and the very low ranges of the singer, of the instrument that they're talking about. That's an avant-garde trend to push the instrument range. You're going to hear that it has a lot of polyphony, so there's a lot of lines imitating each other, but they're very dissonant. It's trying to sound like prehistoric wildlife. It's trying to sound like the awakening of nature. There is no clear meter, which gives it more of an improv feel. So there's your bassoon. Notice quite high. Hard, I think, to imagine that that is a bassoon when that first note sounds out. Here come your polyphonic lines entering, but again, very dissonant. As you listen and go through, you'll notice that when you get to about 2 minutes 40 seconds, you're into the omens of the springs, which this is the dance part of those youths and those maidens. Rhythm is very irregular. Style is very dissonant. You hear the same chord over and over. At one point, there is a chord that is sounded 32 times in succession in eighth notes with accents out of the meter, so syncopation. Notice that your strings are plucking. This is a folk song that they're plucking, different than the folk song that was in that opening. That bassoon line was actually a Lithuanian folk song. Here the strings are playing a very different, a new folk song. Motives are very short. Here's that chord over and over 32 times. Often that's called a Stravinsky ostinato. If you take that forward into about the 6-minute mark, this is the abduction scene. Again, we're hearing nationalism here with the changing meters, the folk tunes, the horn calls. There's a franticness to the rhythm. And then finally takes us to the round dance of spring, which is a little bit quieter. It's a short section. Again, listen to those extremes of register though. That's an E-flat clarinet playing at its absolute top of the range. You've got an alto sax playing at the very lowest of its range. Strong downbeats again, hypnotic meters. Here's another folk song. So this is the third folk song that we're hearing in there. This piece continues with 4 more sections that follow, using many more folk tunes. There isn't a lot of emotion to it, I don't think, in the music, but that primitivism is marked by the fact that I think what sticks with you after hearing that is the rhythm, the driving rhythm. The rhythm is the language, or if you want to even say the new language of primitivism. It's interesting because as different as this work is from his first neoclassic, or his first ballets, which were more of neoclassic style, he turns and kind of goes back down a hill, and the end of his career, he is writing again in a neoclassic style, really emulating Bach and Handel and Mozart, going way back in music history. So this primitivism can be considered part of the Expressionism movement. Expressionism came out of Germany. There are also some Austrian composers that were pressing forward with this, and their music is very complex emotionally. They were very intent on taking these romantic ideas and pushing them to its absolute conclusion of where it could not go anymore. They stressed intense emotion is what they wanted. They exploited hysteria, nightmare, insanity in their plots when they were talking about vocal musics and in their program music. Expressionistic composers tend to have a great interest in psychology, especially in the works of Freud. Dream analysis was a new idea that Freud was writing about at the time. The controlling role of sexuality, studies of hysteria and unconsciousness, we see that used a lot. Painters are doing this, writers, composers, they all seem to be trying to deliberately distort to shock the audience, to anguish the human psyche, or to get a reaction against these expressionistic tendencies. They tended to reject the conventional prettiness of music. They wanted madness, loud sounds, death, anguish, horror of bloodshed. Some of this can be said that they're imitating the horror of what's going on with World War I. It's growing out of some of the turbulent works of Wagner and Mahler. The person that we're going to take a look at for Expressionism is Schoenberg. Schoenberg is a German composer, 1874 to 1951. He was born in Vienna, entirely self-taught. So he was coming of age in the time of Mahler and Brahms and Wagner, and he felt that early music, the traditions of it, he liked the traditions of it, he wanted to carry on the traditions of it, but he felt that you could increase chromaticism and atonality. One of his greatest things that he's well known for is serialism. So serialism, as I mentioned when we were talking about 20th century techniques, is a type of writing where it's using a scale that's always used in a certain order. And we'll take a closer look at that in just a second. But it's all leading to dissonance, getting the emancipation of dissonance. Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, these are three composers your text talks a lot. Sometimes they're called the Second Viennese School because it was a trio of composers that were very important in writing in a new style, a new German style, just like way back we had with Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven being this trio of German composers that were very important. What you have in your text from Arnold Schoenberg is on page 321 is a song cycle. So here's a romantic form. It's lied or art songs that have been put together into a cycle to make them longer. It's one of the most famous 20th century song cycles. It's called Pierre Lunaire, which means Moonstruck Pierrot. It's from 1912. And so Pierre was a tragic clown. It's from the Italian Improv Theater. And he's representing the isolated modern artist. It was composed around the same time as The Rite of Spring. There are 21 songs for soprano and 5 instruments. And so that's different, that it's not just piano and vocalists, but it's different chamber instruments. And one of his new techniques that he developed is Sprechstimme. Sprechstimme is a vocal technique that he developed where the rhythm and the pitches are notated for the singer, but the voice only touches on it and leaves it. It gives a very different sound. It's an extended technique, which means that it's like plucking strings or prepare piano that we'll see later, that's half singing and half speaking. So you'll hear that very clearly in some of these that we listen to. Your book has 2 songs from this song cycle that are being performed, number 8 and number 18. I've given you slightly different, I've given you 8 and 18, but in different forms so that you can see them performed in 2 different ways. So number 8 that I've got here for you is in a theater setting. So it's been staged with music and costumes. Notice that it's got pretty much of a nightmare atmosphere to it. The accompaniment is violin, piano, bass, clarinet, and cello. So very unusual group of 5 instruments. Notice as you listen, there's an ostinato in that bass line, a ground bass, if you will, almost like a passacaglia. That's a very old nostalgic idea that we've talked about too. Notice that her singing, again, is at the very bottom of her range. Also listen to the type of singing. It's not a melodic singing, this is Sprechstimme. When you go on to number 18 of the song cycle, here I've given you a more traditional concert setting of it, a recital setting of it. Again, unusual accompaniment with violin, piano, piccolo, clarinet, violin, and cello, and viola. The piano intro is very dissonant, it's very atonal. So again, you should not be able to hear a home pitch in that. It's a nagging obsession. You can hear there's a very high pitch. There's some imitative entries. There's a fugal passage. It's not 12 tone, but it's very atonal. If something is 12 tone, it would be as if I took and came up with a line. Let's say that I came up with this pattern. So if that's my melody that I came up with there, I'm always going to use those notes in that order. And I have put them purposely in not any scale order so that there's no tonality that you hear in there. So I can use my order this way. I can also do it retrograde or go backwards with it. I can invert it. Instead of going up and up, I can go down and down. So there's different combinations. It comes up with what's called a matrix. Again, it's a very mathematical style of writing that Schoenberg did. Your book talks about Anton Webern. He was a student of Schoenberg's. He was very much interested in this serialistic approach. There's a nice description of it on page 327 for you. I encourage you, if you want, to YouTube some Webern pieces. You Google Webern serialism and you'll get a chance to listen to some pieces. You're going to notice that it's a lot like Schoenberg with the atonality of it. I do want you to take a closer look at the piece by Alban Berg, 1885 to 1935. This is an example of what's happening with opera in this style. So this is an expressionistic opera. It's Wojciech. It's a tragic story of a soldier who is driven to madness by a hostile society. He's kind of an outcast. He's an impoverished soldier. He's made fun of a lot. He's persecuted. He finds out that he's been betrayed by his love, Marie. And so he's obsessed with Marie and he stabs her. And of course, expressionism is tragic and pushing those emotions. He drowns in his attempt to drown her. He also drowns. So it's a very nightmarish atmosphere. It has a lot of dissonance. There are some Wagner-like things to it in the fact that there are some leitmotifs that continue through for different characters. And there's no arias or recitatives. It's a through composed opera. It's very atonal. It is not 12-tone bass. There's no pattern. It was a melody. You are going to hear Sprechstimme in it. There are distorted folk songs in it, giving it a nationalistic quality to it. The orchestra is trying to set the scenery for you. See if in the orchestra you can hear the moon rising or the frogs croaking, the water drowning. There's 5 acts to it. Your book on page 328 will take you through these acts very easily. I have it separated into 2 acts in your canvas. The first is scene 3. So it's where Marcus and Margaret are at the bar scene. You can read through what the story is happening here, listening to the rhythm, listen to the ostinato. And then I put the 4th scene separate on here. And this is the scene where he has gone to the lake or the pond to get rid of the body of his wife, and in the process drowns himself. And if you watch it all the way to the end, there's a little boy figure that rides by on his bicycle, which is his son. So that gives you an example of opera and what's happening with this expressionistic style. So you might be saying, what's happening in America at this time? In America, we don't have that classical tradition that we're growing out of. There's not that classical history. So we're not reacting to anything. The first big figure that we have in America is Charles Ives. Ives was kind of a stubborn nonconformist. He studied music at Yale. He liked to quote hymns in his pieces. He liked to have fugues. He used a lot of polyphony in it. He started out as a life insurance salesman and then turned to composing after about 10 years. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1947 for his 3rd Symphony. He was considered a transcendentalist, so in that vein of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Dissonant music, but in a little bit gentler tone. A lot of piano techniques that you hear in his music. He wrote a lot of piano music, a lot of orchestral music. You have a movement of his, what he called the 2nd orchestral set, movement 2. It's an informal symphony is what it is a symphony. And it's following a revival meeting or of a dance fragment. What I want you in particular to listen for when you are taking a look at this Ives and listening is that if you go to 3 minutes 57 seconds, you'll hear the juxtaposition of a hymn tune against that. His harmony tends to be a little bit in your face, a little bit pounding like Stravinsky. He liked to use whole tone scales, or those scales that we saw impressionistic composers like Debussy using. It's rather scherzo-like. So it's a start for us to see what's going to happen with the trends in America. Ives is a unique way for us to start looking at American music. He tends to take what he likes and disregard what he doesn't like and comes up with a hybrid style that's coming out of America here. So that takes us through chapters 20 and 21.